Throughout nearly 6 decades of his illustrious career in Hollywood, Dustin Hoffman has always been known as a private actor, rarely sharing the darker sides behind the film industry's glamour. But now, at the age of 88, the two-time Oscar-winning legend has finally decided to break his silence about a dark chapter in his career, one directly involving his colleague and rival, Robert Redford. "I've kept this inside for too long," Hoffman admitted in a rare recent interview. "There are truths that when you're young, you choose to swallow because you're afraid they will destroy your career. But when you're 88, you realize that the truth is more important than anything." So, what exactly happened between these two great actors? Why did Hoffman call it the most horrific experience of his career? And more importantly, why did it take nearly 50 years for him to finally speak out? The answer will reveal a little-known dark side of 1970s Hollywood, where ego, power, and fierce competition could turn artistic geniuses into sworn enemies. In the late 1960s, Hollywood witnessed the emergence of two figures who would redefine the American film industry. Dustin Hoffman, with his role as Benjamin Braddock in The Graduate, 1967, broke every mold of the traditional movie star, only one. 67 tall, with an ordinary appearance and Jewish background from Los Angeles, Hoffman represented a new generation of actors, those who captivated audiences with genuine talent, not old-school good looks. Concurrently, Robert Redford was steadily making a name for himself with Butch Cassidy and The Sundance Kid, 1969. In complete contrast to Hoffman, Redford was the embodiment of classic Hollywood beauty, tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, with a captivating smile. Born into a white Anglo-Saxon middle-class family in California, Redford personified the image of the perfect American guy that Hollywood had idolized for decades. But the differences between the two did not stop at appearance. Hoffman was a devotee of method acting, a school of thought that demanded the actor genuinely live the role, experiencing every emotion in the deepest possible way. He spent weeks researching his character, demanding dozens of retakes until achieving absolute perfection. For Hoffman, acting was a sacred art requiring absolute sacrifice and dedication. Dustin always wanted to explore every facet of the character, director Mike Nichols once remarked. He would ask about the character's past, their thoughts, even how they ate breakfast. It was an exhausting process, but created phenomenal performances. Redford, conversely, believed in natural instinct and spontaneity. He rarely over-prepared, preferring to work based on inspiration on set. Redford's style was less said, more felt, generating appeal through his eyes and a cool, mysterious demeanor. For him, overanalyzing would kill the naturalness of the performance. By the early 1970s, both had become leading names, but in very different ways. Hoffman was hailed by critics as an acting genius, winning an Oscar for Kramer vs. Kramer and continuously receiving complex, challenging roles. However, he always felt he had to work twice as hard to gain recognition in an industry that still favored appearance and background. Redford, meanwhile, was not just a movie star but a cultural icon. He was the one film studios pursued, the one who could choose his roles at will. In 1973, when Time magazine featured Redford on its cover with the headline "Robert Redford, the Star," many in the industry began to whisper that he was the most powerful actor in Hollywood. According to an anonymous producer, Bob Redford had something Dustin never could: acceptance without having to prove himself. He walked into a room and people already trusted him. Dustin had to fight for every inch of respect. It was against this backdrop that, in 1975, the two stars received an offer to co-star in a project that could change cinematic history. All the President's Men, the story of two Washington Post journalists who exposed the Watergate scandal. No one expected that this would become the beginning of a nearly half-century-long nightmare for Dustin Hoffman. When Warner Bros. Decided to bring the Watergate story to the big screen, they knew they needed two actors of sufficient stature to portray Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, the two journalists who shook American politics. The final choice seemed perfect on paper. Robert Redford would play Woodward, the calm, somewhat mysterious one, while Dustin Hoffman would play Bernstein, the dynamic, talkative, and energetic Jew. But from the very first days on set, everyone realized that this would not be a harmonious collaboration. The problem began with the fact that Redford was not only the lead actor, but also the film's producer. He had bought the rights to the book, chosen director Alan J. Pakula, and had a decisive say in most aspects of the project. Hoffman, despite being an equally talented actor, came into the role as a hired hand. Right from the start, this power imbalance created a tense atmosphere. Hoffman recalled that even at the first script reading, he felt the difference in how the two were treated. "Everyone in the room looked to Bob," Hoffman recounted. "Not because they didn't respect me, but because Bob was the one with the power. He was the one who decided who stayed and who went." It was a very strange feeling when you are an Oscar-nominated actor, but feel like a supporting character in your own film. As filming began, the differences in their working methods quickly became a source of conflict. Hoffman, faithful to his method acting style, spent weeks meeting the real Carl Bernstein, studying how he walked, talked, and even how he typed. He wanted every scene to be repeated multiple times to find the most perfect emotional nuances. Redford, with his spontaneous style, often achieved what he wanted in the first 1 or 2 takes, and he was clearly unhappy having to wait for Hoffman to search for his character through dozens of attempts. An assistant director at the time recalled, "You could feel the tension in the air. Bob would nail his take perfectly on the second go, and then he would sit there, patient for the first 10 takes, but you could see the frustration gradually creeping onto his face as Dustin asked for the 11th, 12th take. Sometimes Bob would check his watch, sigh, and in Hollywood, the unspoken things are sometimes louder than what is actually said." But what truly hurt Hoffman was not the glances or the sighs. It was the feeling that his opinions were not valued as much as Redford's. In production meetings, when Hoffman offered an idea on how to play a certain scene, he often received a polite but cool response. But when Redford spoke, both director Pakula and the production team seemed to listen with a completely different level of attention. "There was one scene I wanted to play a certain way," Hoffman recounted. "I explained the reason, talked about the character's motivation, the psychology. Alan Pakula nodded, said we'll give it a try, but I knew he didn't really believe in it. 10 minutes later, Bob suggested something completely different, and instantly Alan said, 'Yes, Bob, we'll do it that way.' It wasn't a direct rejection, but the message was crystal clear. This was Bob Redford's film, not Dustin Hoffman's." There was one specific incident that Hoffman would never forget. In a key scene at the Washington Post newsroom, Hoffman felt Bernstein's dialogue needed to be adjusted to more accurately reflect the character's personality. He spent the entire night rewriting some lines, consulted with the real Carl Bernstein, and arrived on set confident that he had improved the script. But when he presented his idea, Redford's reaction stunned him. "Bob looked at me and said, very calmly, 'Dustin, we're not rewriting William Goldman,'" Hoffman remembered, his voice still containing the pain after nearly 50 years. His tone wasn't aggressive, not loud, but that was the issue. It was like a father gently reminding his misbehaving child of his place, and everyone in the room went silent. No one dared to stand up for me. At that moment, I realized I wasn't Bob Redford's partner. I was an employee in Bob Redford's film. The tension escalated when Hoffman realized that even screen time was not being equally distributed. Although the film was advertised as being about 2 journalists, he began to suspect that the script was being adjusted to enhance Woodward's, Redford, role while diminishing Bernstein's. Several scenes that Hoffman had painstakingly prepared were suddenly cut or significantly shortened. When he questioned this, the answer was always for the pace of the film or due to runtime. But Hoffman could not help noticing that Redford's scenes rarely encountered the same issues. The worst part, according to Hoffman, was the feeling of isolation. while Redford had a close relationship with director Pakula, often having lunch and discussing the film's direction privately. Hoffman felt excluded from these conversations. "They made important decisions about the film over lunches I wasn't invited to," he said. "I would arrive on set in the morning and discover that everything had changed, but no one bothered to inform me beforehand. That was a sophisticated, yet very painful form of exclusion." On some days, Hoffman went home in a state of exhaustion, not just physically but mentally. He began to doubt his own talent, wondering if he was exaggerating the issue. But then something would happen: a cold glance from Redford, an important meeting he wasn't invited to, a scene where his opinion was subtly overruled, and he knew he wasn't imagining it. "The horrific thing," Hoffman admitted, "was not that Bob treated me badly publicly. He was always polite, always professional, but that very politeness was the problem. It created an invisible wall I couldn't break through, couldn't complain about without looking like an overly sensitive or jealous person. Bob mastered the art of making you feel like an outsider without ever having to say a harsh word." When the film wrapped production, Hoffman felt like he had just survived a war. Although he was proud of his performance, the entire experience left a deep scar on his psyche. And when All the President's Men was released in April 1976, garnering critical and audience acclaim, Hoffman could not help but notice that most articles focused on Redford, the star, the producer, the one who brought the film to the audience. Hoffman was praised, yes, but always as a footnote in Redford's success story. "That's when I realized," Hoffman said, "that in Hollywood, talent only gets you so far. Power is what truly dictates everything." For nearly 50 years, Dustin Hoffman chose to remain silent about what truly happened during the filming of All the President's Men. But now, as his age and the perspective on his legacy become clearer, he feels it is time to tell the truth, not out of malice, but because history needs to be recorded honestly. "I've lived with this in my gut for too long," Hoffman said in the recent interview. "People look at that film and see a masterpiece. They see two great actors working in harmony, but they don't see what I had to endure to create that performance. They don't know that every day on set, I felt like I was fighting a battle I couldn't win." Hoffman's revelations delved into details that had never before been publicly disclosed. He spoke of an incident during the third week of filming, when he discovered that several crucial scenes for the Bernstein character had been significantly reduced without any discussion with him. When Hoffman questioned director Pakula about this, the answer he received was vague and unconvincing. "We needed to focus on the main plotline." But when Hoffman reviewed the script, he realized that the cut scenes were precisely those that showcased Bernstein's depth and intelligence, scenes that could have placed his character on par with Woodward in the audience's eyes. "I'm not an idiot," Hoffman stated. "I knew what was happening. They were turning Bernstein into a supporting character in his own story, and when I tried to protest, I was treated like a difficult actor, someone who didn't understand the bigger picture. But the bigger picture they spoke of was ensuring that Bob Redford, the star, the producer, was the center of everything." But perhaps what hurt Hoffman most deeply was not the artistic decisions, but how he was treated as a human being. He recounted lunches on set, when Redford and Pakula often sat alone, discussing the film while Hoffman ate by himself or with the supporting cast. He recalled important production meetings that took place in the evening, meetings he knew nothing about until the decisions had already been made. "Once I happened to overhear Bob and Alan talking in Bob's trailer," Hoffman recounted, his voice still filled with emotion. "They were discussing a scene we were going to shoot the next day, an important scene for both characters. They were deciding the approach, the blocking, even the performance style, and I, the person who would have to act in that scene, wasn't invited to the conversation. When I knocked on the door and asked if I could join, Bob looked at me with a look. I will never forget that look. Not anger, but surprise, as if I had violated some invisible boundary. He said, 'Dustin, we're just having a quick chat. We'll talk on set tomorrow morning,' but by the next morning, everything had already been decided." Hoffman also disclosed the subtle pressure he felt from the crew members. Everyone knew Bob was the one with the power, he said. They knew that their careers could depend on keeping Bob happy, so whenever there was any conflict between me and Bob, whether it was about performance, filming time, or anything else, everyone automatically sided with Bob. Not because they thought Bob was right, but because they knew Bob was the power holder. I felt like I was standing alone against an entire system. One of the most painful aspects Hoffman shared was the feeling of being gaslit, being made to doubt his own perception. Every time he felt he was being treated unfairly and tried to speak up, he received reactions that made him wonder if he was being overly sensitive. They would tell me, "Dustin, you're being too intense," or "you're overthinking this." They made me feel like I was the problem, not the situation. And that was perhaps worse than being openly mistreated. Because when you're openly attacked, at least you know you're not crazy. But when it's so subtle, you start to wonder, am I imagining all of this? Hoffman did not hesitate to address the cultural and class element in this power dynamic. Bob represented a certain type of power in Hollywood, he explained. He was the handsome, white, Anglo-Saxon background male. He fit the mold that Hollywood had idolized for decades. I, on the other hand, was Jewish, short, and didn't have the looks of a traditional star. I had to fight for everything. And on the set of All the President's Men, that difference was never spoken but always present. It was in the way people automatically deferred to Bob, the way they assumed he was the natural leader. While I always had to prove myself. There was one specific incident that Hoffman described as the moment of truth. It was when the film was nearing the end of production and there was a small party to celebrate. Hoffman recalled that he tried to speak to Redford, hoping they could resolve the tension and at least finish the project on better terms. I approached Bob and said, "Bob, I know we've had some difficulties, but I want you to know that I respect your work. I hope we can work together again in the future." Bob looked at me, smiled, a polite, professional smile, and said, "Absolutely, Dustin. Thanks for being a part of this," and that was it. No warmth, no genuine connection, just professional courtesy. At that moment, I realized, to Bob, I was never a partner. I was just an employee on his film. What Hoffman called the horrific truth was not a single incident, but the cumulative realization that he had been treated more like a utility than a fellow artist. I poured all my talent, all my emotion, all my passion into that role, he said. But in the eyes of the decision-makers, I was never anything more than a replaceable commodity. If I complained too much, they could find another Dustin Hoffman. But they couldn't replace Bob Redford because Bob wasn't just the actor, Bob was the power. The psychological impact of this experience on Hoffman was profound and long-lasting. He admitted that for many years after All the President's Men, he became more cautious, even fearful in professional relationships. "I learned that talent isn't enough," he said. "You also have to protect yourself, and sometimes that means not trusting people, even when they smile at you." Perhaps the most painful part of Hoffman's revelation is the admission that he kept silent for so long, not only out of fear for his career, but also out of shame. "I was ashamed that I let myself be treated that way," he confessed. "I am Dustin Hoffman, the Oscar-nominated actor, yet I let someone make me feel worthless. And for years, I thought it was my fault, that if I had been stronger, more confident, I wouldn't have let it happen. But now, at 88, I realize it wasn't about strength or confidence. It was about a system designed to favor some and diminish others, and I was just a casualty of that system." When Dustin Hoffman's revelations were published, the Hollywood community quickly divided. Some industry insiders expressed support for Hoffman, confirming that what he described was not an isolated case, but part of the Hollywood culture at the time. Meryl Streep, who has worked with both actors, commented cautiously, "I wasn't there, so I can't speak to the specifics of what happened, but I know that power dynamics on a film set can be very complicated and sometimes toxic. If Dustin felt unfairly treated, that feeling is real for him." Director Sidney Pollack, who worked with Redford on multiple projects, offered a different perspective. Bob Redford is one of the most professional people I've ever worked with. He's demanding, yes, but he never intentionally sets out to hurt anyone. However, the words defending Redford seemed unable to dispel the growing empathy for Hoffman's story. Other actors began sharing their similar experiences on other film sets, creating a wave of discussion about the power imbalance in the film industry. Gene Hackman, a longtime colleague of both, offered a more balanced perspective. "I love both Bob and Dustin. They are two great artists with very different styles. But I have to say, when one person is both the actor and the producer, the lines can get blurred. It's not always easy to separate business power from the creative relationship." What is notable is the reaction from Robert Redford's side, or rather, the absence of a reaction. Since Hoffman's revelations were published, Redford has maintained almost complete silence. His representative released a brief statement. "Mr. Redford has positive memories of working with Dustin Hoffman on All the President's Men. He respects Dustin as an actor and has no further comment on these personal statements." This silence has fueled much speculation. Some suggest that Redford is taking the high road by not engaging in a public dispute. Others, however, view this silence as a tacit admission that there may be some truth to what Hoffman has said, and Redford does not wish to exacerbate the situation by denying it. Has Dustin Hoffman's story changed the way you view All the President's Men? Do you think he was right to speak out after nearly 50 years? Or do you believe this is simply an exaggerated misunderstanding? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. We would love to hear your perspective on the culture of power in Hollywood and whether the industry has truly changed. If this video has offered you a new perspective on these Hollywood legends, don't forget to like and share so more people can learn this truth. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the untold stories about Hollywood stars. Next week, we will reveal another shocking secret from behind the scenes of The Godfather. Trust me, you won't believe what you hear.